We're creating about as many jobs as those other metros combined.
So Bend hates to be compared to Boulder.
We could have a whole hour conversation about this. I think it sets us up another kind of foundation.
Participating. I think that's the difference between being a citizen or sitting on the sidelines.
These conversations are brought to you by the Ladd Group, Bend's leading real estate team. Help continue this BendBeat conversation by subscribing, sharing, and leaving us a review. I was having a little trouble opening this because we were just laughing about, our history. We've known each other a long time, but I'm here with Brian Rankin, and your official role is the long-term planning manager for the City of Bend?
Yeah, long-range planning manager.
Long-range planning manager for the City of Bend. Okay, well, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for hosting today.
Oh no, it's fun. I like to use this podcast to have discussions about kind of everything Bend, but as you know, I'm a housing guy and I like to look at things through housing and how it affects everything from, inclusion and diversity and homelessness and business growth and kind of where Bend is going. And you're absolutely in the epicenter of that. So your time is valuable and, I appreciate you sharing it.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity and just folks staying involved and being involved, having questions, and then venues to get out of City Hall and try to reach more people across the community. So thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about why you're in Bend. I mean, obviously, you're head of planning, but let's talk about, your family. Why, what brought you here and what's your family like? Who is Brian Rankin?
Well, I came up here visiting some buddies from high school.
Okay. And when was this?
Back in '92.
Okay.
Was the first time I visited Bend. And, getting out of college, being in college, getting out of college.
Where'd you go to school?
I graduated from UC Davis.
Okay.
Down at Davis, California. And I grew up in Northern California, kind of northern central California. Tiny communities. Well, the biggest town is called Sonora. Or is Sonora, California. But I grew up on a ranch outside of that. So I had been in California for a number of years and, realized there was a lack of opportunity in my hometown. I thought the hometown was the best place in California, quite frankly, after being in a variety of locations. So joined some high school buddies up here to start a band.
Really?
Yeah, high school band. We're gonna. Yeah, you really come to
break
Bend.
through.
You come to Bend to make it in music.
Okay.
Right? Back in the '90s. Anyway, and then just absolutely fell in love with Bend.
Okay. So would you play in the band?
I was a singer.
Please, yes, I was going to say, please say vocals. That's awesome.
Well, screamer.
Okay. Well,
so anyway, that was that. That's how I got up here, and I've loved it ever since. It's always been home.
Yep. And one boy, right? One son?
One boy.
Yeah, he played with my son on the, was it the Cubs or the White Sox? Or
so many teams. There were Flames, there were Giants, there were all kinds of different teams.
And then my son was the Lava Bears, and your son was an Elk.
Elk, yeah, he was an Elk.
Is your son still in it?
No.
My son pulled the plug.
Yeah, he pulled the plug in high school. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, so, which, he has the skills, though. That's the important thing. He knows how to throw and hit a ball, and he loves it, so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk planning. Growth is the the word du jour of and change in Bend right now. It's not always been that way. We've had a lot of iterations of what Bend is. But we're having a very dynamic time right now. We're on the backside of the pandemic where we had a lot of in-migration and then that has slowed. We have a 5,000 house shortage here in Bend, according to the city and Eric. And we have housing affordability issues, et cetera. And I think it's, you can add a lot of insight on where we are and how we're trying to meet that demand.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of people are saying, why can't the city just open up the gates and make housing happen?
Right.
And we're in a really interesting environment with the Oregon land use laws. But if you could give me a little bit of insight on kind of how the city of Bend plans and how we try to meet the forces that we're seeing today.
Okay. Yeah, it's a big question. So I'll try to break it down a little bit. we talk about growth today, right? Growth and change of today. And I think some context is important. I was just looking at a graph of growth, population growth since the 70s in
Yep.
Bend. And if you look at a chart of growth, it's consistently been growing over that time. Pretty slow in the 70s and early 80s. And you get to the 90s, starting in the 90s, in late 80s and 90s and up through 2000s, you see explosive growth, much faster than you see today
Yep.
as a percentage of growth. And then, of course, the Great Recession hit.
Yep.
Late 2008, 7, 8, 9, 10. We heal from that and our population growth continuing. And, pretty consistently around 2 to 4% per year in that time period that we're talking about. It's kind of leveling out now around 2.5 to 3% per year. That and projected forward,
Yep.
right? So Bend has been growing and continues to grow and change for its history.
That's
right?
our DNA.
It's
yeah.
in our DNA.
Yeah.
I remember reading some old articles from the Bulletin in the 20s about affordable housing crisis, lack of housing, back in those boom days as well. So I think this is baked into a lot of it's kind of part of our DNA has been.
Sure.
So, we look at growth and you talk, what is growth, right? Population growth, one, right? So we think of the people moving here. The other one is employment growth. So we have an incredibly vital economy in Deschutes County and in Bend. And so we have both kinds of growth, enviable to some, and also it causes these stressors that we're talking about. So the question is, what do you do about that? What's the city doing about that?
Yeah.
I think it's important to mention, first of all, the state of Oregon, because when we're talking about growth in Bend, we are part of the state of Oregon, and the state of Oregon is increasingly more and more involved in how cities plan for growth, particularly around housing, less so on economic development. So right now, as we speak, in the last couple of years, there's a huge amount of change and movement and evolution in how the state is regulating the planning for and provision of housing. Last year, there was a big bill, House Bill 2001, that will completely change how cities are focusing their efforts on planning for housing growth. And so just as a snapshot of that, the state will be telling us, here are the number of people that you're planning for. It will be considering not just your normal population growth that we've looked at in the past, but it'll account for houselessness, people that are experiencing houselessness. We'll add that on top. We're going to add a factor for vacation homes and second homes, and also undersupply, that housing that's not getting built. So for the first time, the state is going to give us numbers in the coming years that says, this is your number of units that you have to plan for.
As a minimum.
As a minimum. And it tends to be a minimum maximum.
And a maximum.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's really both.
Pretty
They're like,
prescribed.
Here's your target. It's very prescribed. And then it's going to go further and say, okay, of these people, we're going to break this down in income levels. Area median income is your average amount of income that a family makes, right? In Bend, it's almost $100,000. It's about $97,000 for a family of 4. And so the state's going to say, here are your numbers. This is what you're planning for. And it'll probably be in the 25,000 housing units for the next 20 years. And then we're going to break it down by income. They'll say, this income level, you need this many units. This income level, this many units, and up the scale. And then this bill will require cities to then plan for building that housing. And it will force cities and require cities to track the amount of housing and then report to the state. And then the state will track that housing development growth. And then if the city is short here or there, it will start to audit and essentially enforce on the city for especially cities that are bad actors and just saying, we're not doing any of this stuff, we're not trying. Then the state can come back and say, you know what, you need to do more on this and this and this. So that landscape is changing a lot. So that's kind of the overarching, from the state, from the perspective in the state, that's brand new for the city.
So it's a little bit of loss of autonomy on your own planning?
It is. It's essentially, I think it's recognizing, the state and the legislators are recognizing that some cities, not all cities, have had a history of not planning for enough diversity and affordability of housing units. And so
Agreed.
it's almost taking it out of the hands of a city and saying, now here are the numbers and
Go
deal
get
with
it.
this
Go
because of the affordable housing crisis across
Yeah.
the state
Yes.
and in Bend. Yeah, so that's one component though. That's just one, so this is kind of the raw
Yeah.
numbers. And then you go, well, how do you accommodate it? Like,
Yep.
what are we gonna do about it? The city makes a plan that looks ahead and
Yeah.
says, okay, what's our capacity for housing? Right now, we estimate we have capacity in our current urban growth boundary for around 23,000 housing units.
Yeah.
We look at our capacity, and then we look at providing more capacity for different kinds of housing units. So there's a land use planning
Yeah.
function. It could mean expanding our urban growth boundary, for example, going out
Yeah.
to provide more housing units. It could mean going up or densifying in certain areas of the city. And then it gets into, I would say, more subtle but very, very powerful aspects of providing housing on the kinds of regulations we have, being more allowing a wider variety of units in a wider variety of locations, especially more affordable types of units.
Yeah.
And then also we're exploring other incentives and financial incentives to allow those kinds of housing units to come up off the ground, as well as just the procedural kind of somewhat mundane, but the procedural requirements in our development codes, like making it easier and faster and easier and faster to produce certain kinds of housing units.
Wow. So you've got your hands full. I mean, for me, it's reassuring that the state understands the depth of the housing crisis. I think it's most visible in those that are experiencing houselessness, homelessness. But then I think, on so many other levels, it affects our community, from business owners trying to hire that, they can't afford to hire employees at any wage because there's no houses for them to live in. Or for those that are, you talk to any local service professional, whether it be a teacher or fire department or whatnot through, the challenge of living in Bend is becoming increasingly difficult.
Yeah.
We just crossed it where our median price in Bend is $760,000, and that includes all product type, right?
Yeah.
If we go to single family housing in Bend, it has an 8 in front of it.
Yeah.
I mean, those are uncomfortable numbers.
Yes.
And I think this is an absolute crisis level issue.
Yeah, it is, and I think we all recognize that. And
Yeah.
So when I am talking and speaking with different folks,
Yeah.
some folks think the city actually, either has a direct hand in building housing.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. So let's
And-
get to that.
Yeah, and just to clarify that is not really the city's primary role. So, the price of housing and the vast majority of housing, say 99% of the housing that's built in Bend is built by the private sector.
Yep.
It is priced by the private sector,
Yeah.
right? And so you ask, well, what does the city do in that
Yeah.
environment? The city has a role on funding affordable housing, right? So there are financial mechanisms that the city has at its disposal, essentially ways of collecting money for affordable housing.
Yep.
And that is a good start,
Yep.
right? However, that is certainly not sufficient in terms of the scale and the amount to actually
meet that.
provide that level of demand, as you're saying.
Yeah, because those lower rungs of the product, of the housing ladder, are not always necessarily market rate. And are you building that into zoning and mandates for new developments?
Yeah, and that will come out of the state will say, we've done this in the past, by the way, so I don't
Yeah.
want to create the impression that we have not been paying attention to
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
We have. I just want to focus on the change. Is that there will be very, very clear, there will be a deficit of tens of thousands, it could be tens of thousands, let me think, thousands of housing units, not tens of thousands, that will clearly require some degree of either subsidy or a shift in the private market to provide that kind of housing that is affordable at the low, I would say median income ranges and down.
Yep.
And so the focus there, we clearly can't have that degree of scale of subsidized housing.
Yeah.
So what do cities do? And the state has stepped in some ways in this case as well,
Yeah.
which is to allow a wider variety and type of housing units. Examples. It used to be in our single family zones, where we see predominantly single family homes.
Yep.
They were mostly exclusively for that kind of type of unit.
Yep.
Well, now those single family and single unit developments have to allow a duplex, they have to allow a triplex, they have to allow a quadplex, they have
Yep.
to allow short single room occupancies. That's a big shift that really hasn't hit the market yet. It's something that's relatively new.
Yep.
So the question will be, will homes convert? Will we see single family homes convert to a duplex, convert to a triplex, convert to more of a multifamily format, or 4 more units in these areas or not? That would increase the supply of those kinds of units, which tend to be more affordable.
Yep.
In commercial zones, now the state is saying you will allow affordable housing at a certain degree of income or less. You're
Yep.
just going to do it. Well, we couldn't do that before.
Yeah.
It was not really permissible by the state.
Okay.
So, yeah, so there are these kind of big changes that are happening. We haven't really seen how they play out
Yeah.
at the local level yet.
Brian Ladd here. I hope you're enjoying the conversation and find this dialogue relevant to really what it means to live and work and play in this amazing community. As Ben's leading real estate team, we take our role seriously in representing both buyers and sellers at the absolute highest standards of our industry. For more information on how we can help, feel free to visit our website at benpropertysource.com or text LAD1, LADD1 to 88,000.
Do you see the local building and development force able to meet the vision of what you guys have for built product, built environment?
I have to say, so far, so far, yes. I think what I'm seeing is it's just a question of how quickly can
Yeah.
a whole variety of industries shift. It
Yep.
takes time for industry structures to shift.
Yep.
Right? So we're talking about local builders, local developers, and then locals themselves,
Yeah.
being supportive of those kinds of policies and those
Yeah.
kinds of products in their neighborhoods. So in 2016 we approved the urban growth boundary expansion, and that allowed more capacity for housing
Yep.
outside of the prior urban growth boundary.
Yeah.
We also adopted packages of changes inside. So when you drive around town and you see, wow, that's a 6 or 7 story building with
Yep.
300 apartments.
Yep.
You couldn't do that back in those places back in 2000, 2010 or 15.
Yeah.
Now you can. And so in a very short period of time, the market has shifted in a major way.
Yeah.
To create product that has not been out there. So I suspect with the incredible demand
Yeah.
that we will continue to see that kind of evolution
Yep.
throughout Bend.
Well, I think it's exciting. I mean, change is tough, and I'm sure you get a lot of negative feedback on change. But I think harnessing it and directing it to create a more inclusive, diverse Bend, I think is going to be good on all levels.
Yeah.
And that doesn't come without challenges. I think one of the big things that I've kind of put a note in or a pin in and said, I'm watching this, is the redevelopment of the Bend Central Redevelopment District. Proper name for that is
Bend Central District. Yeah,
Bend
you got
Central
it.
District. And to go from horizontal to vertical is a monumental shift in how things are built and done.
Yeah.
Are we going to, is the city and the state laws mandating a specific amount of development there before more expansion on the urban growth boundary? Is that going to create conflict? Because I have a suspicion that that's going to be slower to go vertical than a lot of people think. I think it's going to be a long-term play.
Yeah.
And are we waiting on that to go vertical to do other things? Is that becoming a sticking point, a roadblock?
Not directly.
Okay. You know, I hear about climate-friendly initiative of a certain percentage of the new product has to be within walkable zones and things like that. If that doesn't happen fast enough, does that stop us from meeting our housing needs elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the way of, when you think about housing need, right?
Yep.
It's really different kinds of needs. So there's a need for certain types of housing units, right?
Sure.
And they don't necessarily compete with one another. So we just, our small division did a study. It was through a grant from Department of Land Conservation and Development. And so we analyzed what's our capacity and what might be the need for an urban growth boundary expansion as of today,
Yep.
before all the changes in state law. And what we learned was we have a considerable amount of capacity for example, mixed use development that you were talking about. And we have quite a bit of capacity for called middle housing, so duplexes, triplexes, 4 units. We have quite a bit of capacity for that.
Yeah.
Where we're short would be in the traditional, more single unit detached.
Yep.
And so we estimated we'd need between, say, 200 to 700 acres of additional land outside of our current urban growth boundary to accommodate that.
Yep.
Now, those numbers can change because the
Yeah.
state is going to give us those housing numbers in the future.
Yep.
It could go up, it could go down. But they don't necessarily compete with one another
Yeah.
because we're talking about different locations and different product, right?
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right, the Bend Central District, if you look at a map right now and you look at where housing units have been built, we don't see a ton of housing, if any, new housing being built in the Bend Central District.
Yep.
But what you will see is that in that area by, say, the box factory, the old Core Pine site, you know, that area has been approved for almost 2,000 housing units.
That's
where
massive.
previously that was, if you've been here for a while, you know, you had Spokamoto, which we're going to miss Spokamoto, and it's
Great
you know,
coffee
that
shop.
was a great place. It's in a new location, but the old location, and then of course the Core Pine site, if you remember, that was an industrial,
Yeah.
you know, site, and so now that's going to be a vital area with 2,000 housing units over time.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of an area that is popping now. It'll
Yeah.
pop now. And then in Bend Central, you have big new investments. You have almost $30 million for a pedestrian bridge.
Yeah.
You have potentially a new city hall. You have geo bond projects, which are going to improve. So you incentivize that kind of development in that area with public dollars to then create the amenities,
Yep.
to then attract the private development capital.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. It's going to take some time, and it's going to be a little gritty for a while.
Yep.
But I think over time that area will transform.
Well, it's a critical point, and it's tough to change. It's tough for builders to redefine that they're not just 10,000 square foot lot, single family builders, and they become more vertical, they become more mixed use.
Yeah.
But I think the opportunity is immense, but I think ultimately the outcome, I think, is going to make us a more vibrant, durable, long-term, you know, a city with long-term viability than we currently are at right now.
Yeah, you know, if you look at Bend and you look at our housing,
Yep.
the majority of the housing in Bend is still single unit detached,
Yeah.
right? And that's because we've had a history of building most of the product that has been built has been that kind of housing.
Yeah.
And so we're still primarily that's the majority of housing. Over time, what I expect is that will shift. So we'll see more areas in the core of the city that are getting that kind of city feel.
Yep.
You know, it's mixed use. It's more dense. You're still going to have your neighborhoods that we already have in place that are you know, lower density, but provide that single unit kind of living style. And what we'll start to see will be little places here and there that will have a little bit more of that density in the neighborhood scale, in the neighborhood setting. You'll see a little conversion here to a duplex, a triplex, a duplex, a triplex. And what's ironic about that, people are, I think, you know, rightly kind of concerned about change in their neighborhood. But that's typically how older neighborhoods were built in the 20s when Bend was established anyway.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like Back to the Future in a sense.
Okay.
The neighborhoods were more integrated in terms of the housing types before all this land use planning started to take root and
Yep.
affect these neighborhoods. So it may be something new, but it's actually something quite old.
I think that's a really interesting way of describing it. And let's focus on that a little bit, because part of what you guys are doing right now are trying to create whole communities within Bend.
Yep.
Let's talk about that. What does that mean, whole communities? Because I'm reassured by that, and to see the energy and synergy of some of these centers that you guys are, guys and gals, excuse me, are focusing on, create some vibrancy and are helping us overcome a lot of the negative feedback you get with growth, and of urban sprawl, of traffic, of congestion, of it taking a half hour to get across town to get your needs met, to go from employment to schooling to dining, et cetera. Let's talk about your focus on whole communities and what that means for the future of Bend.
Sure. Well, we're out here at Northwest Crossing, filming in Northwest Crossing, I think, which is an example of the evolution of a complete community. Now, granted, it has its very unique setting. I think it's in a strong market area, highly desirable. But people often forget that what we're seeing today really took shape and was planned decades ago.
Yeah. This was a 90s vision, right?
Yeah. So there was a vision that was essentially around a complete community. I remember it being on paper when I first started out in planning. And I remember an important decision around siting schools out in Northwest Crossing. They weren't previously sited there, right? School district worked with Brooks and said, we're thinking of doing a school out here. High Lakes Elementary.
Yeah.
Right? So if you think of the pieces of a complete neighborhood, you think you have your housing, you have a variety of housing. You have a school, ideally, within a reasonable distance, a walking distance, ideally. You have some commercial uses where people can actually just take either a short drive or a bike ride or walk to get to a fun, interesting destination. And it takes time. I think that's the thing, is that has been rooted in our plans in each UGB expansion area.
Okay.
It is part of our planning, and it's actually happening.
Yeah, so let's talk about what
takes time.
It takes time.
What
does it look like? So let's talk Southeast Bend, some beautiful parks, lots happening there. What's the vision for, a whole community in that area?
Yeah, and I think it's a great example because it's, people ask me, what do you think what's the next area that is going to it's really going to not just pop, but like change in a way that it's going to hopefully bring amenities as well as just you'll feel the change. And I think
the vibrancy.
Yeah, feel the vibrancy, and I think that's the Southeast because if you kind of back up, the city invested in the Southeast Interceptor to provide sewer service to an area that didn't have sewer for decades. Murphy Road, another big public investment, right? So a big project that created a great transportation facility. You think, okay, now the library is going to be sited down in the Southeast. You have Alpenglow Park, fantastic amenity down there. So Parks is investing, schools is investing, the library district is investing, and the city has a plan that's saying, okay, we have all these ingredients. We have commercial. They're large commercial areas that are planned and eventually will be built on 27th Street. 27th Street itself is, now it's kind of a raceway south of Reed. You look at it, it's a straight shot, right? Now imagine in the future you have a roundabout at Reed, you have another roundabout at Ferguson, you have roundabouts in between, right? So now you've slowed that down, you make it easier for people to walk and bike. You have some things on 27th Street, you have shopping, you have services, you have public institutions, you have housing, you have open space, you have trail networks. So that area is going to, over time, now have the ability for folks who have just been in a residential area to be like, wow, now I can get on my bike and do a half mile bike or a mile bike and get to a brewery, get to childcare, not unless if you're going to carry your kids on your bike, which I see a lot of people doing. So the idea is to really have complete neighborhoods where you have this mix of uses, and it's more convenient for people to get there with a shorter car trip or a bike trip or a walk trip, but also it creates value in the neighborhoods that are there,
Yeah.
and value in the new neighborhoods that occur.
Yeah.
That actually increases your property values over time, to have a wider variety of uses fairly close to you.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think it creates a higher quality of life for everybody.
Yeah.
And I'm excited by that. So speaking of quality of life, what I'm really encouraged by that I hear over and over again from the city is diversity, inclusion. They're trying to cast a wider net and change the paradigm of who's driving the decisions and vision for who lives here and who's making the decisions. So, let's talk about that a little bit. How is diversity and inclusion being incorporated when you're talking planning at the city of Bend?
yeah. Well, you're absolutely right that in planning, there's usually just a good practice, but in Bend, it's a well-established practice to do community outreach, to do public involvement.
Yeah.
And so the way equity, I think, is shaping our work now, has, and now even, I think, more so, is to really move the decisions from, say, a typical meeting down at City Hall.
Yep.
Right?
That everybody doesn't have access or time for or knowledge
You
of.
don't have, you may not have the time, you may not have the access, maybe, it may not be in, it may not be in a language that's native, for example.
Yep.
So you're really putting effort into, okay, let's get out into different communities, get out of City Hall and into places to reach a wider variety of voices. And where there are target groups, and there are groups that are maybe more hesitant to show up to that meeting or show up to maybe an open house, to really try to create the relationships with different community members and to build trust and a relationship and listen to the input that they are providing and do our darn best to move forward with that kind of input. We have a project in our division called Climate Friendly Areas Study.
Okay.
And a component of that is, first of all, analyzing equity. Like, where do we have issues of potential displacement? And where do we want to be really careful of displacement? And where we'd want to adopt anti-gentrification, anti-displacement strategies, right? So to be hyper aware that if we're doing a public action here, you're going to be really careful to not exacerbate displacement. And then also to host meetings and focus groups and surveys with targeted folks that can represent the viewpoints of folks that need to be represented in the process. And
Yep.
historically maybe have not been represented in that process.
Yep.
So it's really building trust, listening, having conversations, and then honoring those conversations by making sure that those points are brought forward in the decision-making process throughout the life of a project. I think this city council is extremely supportive of that concept and of that work, and I really appreciate them for highlighting that. Another example is Stevens Road Tract, which is a urban growth boundary is about to be expanded by about 261 acres down in the southeast. Worked with a variety of community groups to figure out, okay, well, how could we do this more equitably in terms of our land use?
Yep.
Parks is going to be providing a large community park, and then to put deed restricted affordable units, the more affordable units, in and around that park, in and around down like kind of a neighborhood level commercial area, close to a school and close to transit. So that may sound subtle, but it's actually a big shift, which is, if you think about it, we're planning this community with the affordable housing component in the heart of this community, rather than some practices which some cities have taken in the past, which is just, let's put those affordable units over here and let's put them over there.
Yeah.
No, that's putting those units front and center to give them, I think, the juiciest cut of a really cool neighborhood.
Well, I'm incredibly excited to hear this, and I think it reassures me that the future of Bend is going to be more resilient and diverse than ever, and I think that's good on so many levels, from human rights to economy to the environment. You know, I think for those, including myself, who sometimes get down when we have so much change and turmoil, and you know, whether it's economically or housing or whatnot, or forest fires, you know, it's easy to kind of get frustrated on, perhaps maybe a little pessimistic on the future of Bend. But I think what you guys are doing over at the city is creating a future that is going to be more resilient and inclusive than ever. I mean, I authentically believe that.
Well, personally, I believe it. I mean, we go to work every day and it's not just me.
Yeah.
It's across the city. You know, people are going to work every day with that goal. We don't go to work. Of course, work is difficult. It gets us down. We have our bad days.
Sure.
But you know, the group that I work with and the folks that I work with, you know, we want Bend and are hoping and working for Bend to be the best community and continue to be the best community. And I personally and professionally, I think Bend is poised to be incredibly successful in the future, especially relative to other communities. If you know, think of resilience. Well, we do need to take care of wildfire resilience, for example. That's probably our major natural disaster threat.
Yes.
Right. Our water supply systems are holding up, and they're good for the foreseeable future. But we're going to have to be wise with our water going forward. The size of Bend is fairly small. It's fairly compact, right? It's not a sprawling metropolis with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lane roads crisscrossing it.
Yeah.
It is very walkable and bikeable. It is set up for the community in the future when we have changes in technology that will change our transportation systems. When we think of the future, think of 20 years in the future, I think Bend is really well positioned to continue to be vital and resilient and vital.
Yeah. Well, I certainly need to hear this today, and I hope others hear it as well, because I think for those that don't understand the hard work that's being done by all the women and men over at the City of Bend with a vision like this, hopefully this adds some insight that what's happening is not haphazard, it's not reactive. You know, it's very proactive, and it's visionary. Well, and to be honest, I think unfortunately we're pretty unique in that. If you look around at a lot of the cities that are growing across the West, there's not much vision.
Well, what's interesting about these times is I think it's 2023.
Yep.
We did a plan back in 2016 that gets us through, say, 2028. What I've learned from that is that that making changes and taking some bold policy actions actually work in Bend, that the community is resilient and adaptive.
Yeah.
And we're seeing changes occur in a fairly short period of time. And that we have an opportunity in the next couple of years to do another, and we will be doing another 20-year look in a 20-year plan for our economy, for housing, how we're going to grow, and where we're going to grow. And so that is a very exciting moment where these topics can come into that project.
Yep.
And we can have these hard conversations about how we're going to grow and what we want to be in the next 20 years and beyond. So it's about land use, it's about our neighborhoods, but it can also be about how we get around in our transportation systems, and also impacts on infrastructure. So, all of these topics they're going to continue to be addressed by the city. And every time we do this is going to be an opportunity for the public to get involved in a variety of ways as they see fit. And we'll try to make it as easy as possible, so that we can have a vision which people say, okay, I may not like everything, I might love some of it, I might hate some of it, I see where we're going, and I want to go there, right?
Yeah.
So nothing is done behind closed doors, and the more we include a brilliant community, the better off we're all going to be.